The night was heavy with silence, the kind of silence that carries a warning, a silence that almost whispers that something is about to happen, something that will change everything. Out there in the city, lights flickered in tall glass towers, cars passed with hurried faces behind the wheel, but inside Emily's small apartment, the world was different. She sat by the window staring at nothing, her tea growing cold on the table, her heart still aching from truth she never wanted to face. Her story did not begin with revenge. It began with love, the kind that blinds you, the kind that makes you believe that forever is real. When Emily first met Daniel Carter, she felt like she had stepped into a story she never thought she would belong to. He was confident, charming, a man who walked into every room as if the world already knew his name. And maybe it did. His business was rising fast, his empire expanding with the kind of speed that made newspapers write about him, investors chase him, and ordinary people look at him with admiration. To Emily, he was more than all that. He was a dream, a protector, someone who made promises with such conviction that she believed every word. The first time he looked at her across that crowded gallery, the world seemed to pause. She still remembered the way he smiled, like he already knew she was the one he had been waiting for. They talked for hours that night, about art, about life, about futures they barely understood but desperately wanted. Emily left that evening with her heart pounding, her cheeks hurting from smiling, and her soul telling her that something important had begun. And it had. Their relationship grew quickly. Dinners turned into trips. Trips turned into whispered talks about forever. He told her about his dreams, about building something that would outlast him, about creating a legacy that people would remember. And when he spoke, Emily believed him. She saw in him not just a businessman, but a man who could hold her heart carefully, someone who could build not only companies, but also a future where they belonged together. But what Emily didn't know then was that Daniel was a man of masks. His smile, his promises, his soft words. They were real enough to make her fall, but they hid layers she could not yet see. In the beginning, life felt perfect. Emily loved the way he made her feel like she was the only one in the room, the way he brushed her hair from her face when she was speaking, the way he held her hand as if letting go was impossible. She loved the grand gestures, the surprise gifts, the candlelit dinners, but more than that, she loved the quiet moments, the times they sat on the couch with nothing but a movie playing, or the way he would text her in the middle of the day just to say he missed her. She thought this was it. She thought she had found the man who would never break her heart. Time, however, has a way of showing truths that love tries to hide. It began with small cracks, little things Emily brushed aside. A phone call he would step outside to take, a message he would quickly hide, late nights at the office that didn't quite add up. She asked questions, of course, but Daniel always had answers, smooth, practiced answers that made her doubt herself instead of him. "You worry too much," he would say with that easy smile. And for a while she believed him, but love cannot blind you forever. One night, while he slept, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. Emily never thought of herself as the kind of person who snooped, but something in her heart pressed her to look. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling, and what she saw burned her eyes and her soul. Messages, not one, not two, but dozens, with another woman. Words of affection, promises of time together, secrets shared that should have been hers alone. Her chest tightened. Tears welled, but more than sadness, what she felt in that moment was betrayal, a deep betrayal that cut deeper than any knife could. She put the phone down gently, careful not to wake him, and lay back in the bed with her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, the weight of his lies pressing down on her. That night something inside Emily broke. But alongside the break, something else was born. A spark, a flame that would one day become fire. She didn't confront him immediately. She watched. She waited. She wanted to see how far his lies stretched. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly she began to uncover more. Not only was he betraying her heart, but it was also building his empire on fraud. The man who had spoken about legacy was cutting corners, forging documents, lying to investors, weaving a net of deceit so wide that eventually it was bound to collapse. Emily realized then that she had been living beside a stranger. The man she loved was not the man she thought he was. He wasn't just a partner who betrayed her. He was a liar who betrayed everyone who trusted him. The pain was unbearable, but out of that pain came a decision. She would not cry silently in the shadows. She would not be the quiet victim of his lies. If Daniel Carter thought he could destroy her and walk away unscathed, he was wrong because Emily had something he didn't have: patience, intelligence, and the truth. And so, she began her own silent game. Every word he said, she committed to memory. Every lie she stored. Every document he carelessly left on his desk, she studied. She wasn't reckless. She was deliberate. She built her plan not with anger, but with precision. If he had used her heart, she would use her mind. Nights grew long, days heavy, but Emily kept her face calm whenever she was with him. She smiled at his jokes. She kissed him goodnight. She played her role perfectly, all while collecting the pieces of the empire he had built on sand. And Daniel never suspected. He thought she was still blinded by love, still the same trusting woman who looked at him with admiration. But behind her eyes, the fire grew, and as the city moved on, unaware, Emily prepared for the storm that was coming. Because when betrayal cuts you open, you have two choices: let it bleed you dry, or turn it into a weapon. Emily chose the weapon. The days that followed were heavy, not with arguments or shouting, but with silence. Emily carried the weight of the truth inside her like a stone pressed against her chest. Daniel still smiled the way he always did, still kissed her cheek when he left for work, still promised dinners that turned into excuses, but now she saw through it all. Every word he spoke felt like glass shattering, every touch felt like fire burning. She wondered how long she had been blind, how many lies she had swallowed whole, how many promises had been empty from the start. And yet she played along. She became an actress in her own life, smiling when she wanted to scream, nodding when she wanted to accuse. It wasn't because she was weak. It was because she was planning. At first, she thought maybe she could confront him, demand the truth, force him to admit what she already knew. But then she realized something men like Daniel didn't confess. They denied, they twisted, they turned every accusation into a weapon. He would laugh, call her paranoid, say she was imagining things. And worst of all, he would keep on lying. No, she wouldn't give him that chance. Instead, she watched him closely. She noticed how he carefully locked his office drawer, how he avoided eye contact when certain phone calls came in, how he grew restless whenever financial reports were mentioned. It wasn't just betrayal of love, It was betrayal of trust on every level. He wasn't only cheating on her. He was cheating the world. One night she followed him. She waited until he left with his excuse of a late meeting, and she trailed behind, careful, quiet, heart racing as she watched his car slide through the streets. He parked at a hotel, not the kind meant for business, but the kind where secrets are kept behind closed doors. Emily sat in her car, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and watched as he stepped out, adjusted his tie, and greeted a woman waiting by the entrance. They laughed together. They touched. They disappeared inside. Emily didn't cry. She didn't scream. She only sat there, staring at the hotel lights, her breath shallow, her chest aching. That was the moment the last piece of love inside her died. Whatever softness she had held for him, whatever hope she had clung to, dissolved into cold determination. She drove home in silence, her mind already racing ahead. If Daniel thought he could break her heart and still walk proudly in the world, he had underestimated her. If he thought she would sit quietly and let him build an empire of lies, he was wrong. In the days that followed, Emily's quiet investigation turned sharper. She found the weak points he thought no one would notice: old emails, shredded documents she pieced together, contracts that didn't make sense. And with every discovery, the picture grew clearer. Daniel wasn't a genius businessman. He was a fraud. He had forged signatures, manipulated accounts, and tricked investors. His empire wasn't built on brilliance. It was built on deception. And the irony was cruel. The man who had once promised Emily forever, who had once told her she was the only one he could trust, had made his entire life a performance of betrayal. The conflict inside her grew heavier. Some nights she lay awake, torn between heartbreak and fury. Part of her wanted to run, to leave it all behind, to escape his shadow and start fresh. But another part, stronger, louder, refused. Why should she walk away broken while he walked away powerful? Why should he be allowed to destroy her and then continue destroying others? No, that wasn't justice. The conflict between love and hate, between heartbreak and revenge, shaped her every thought. She still remembered the man she had fallen for, the way he looked at her that first night, the promises they had whispered about their future. But those memories weren't enough to silence the truth. The man she loved was gone, if he had ever existed at all. And so, she decided, she wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't just confront him. She would end him. Not with violence, not with rage, but with truth. She would pull the mask from his face in front of the entire world. She would break not only his lies, but his empire. The plan would take time. She had to be careful. Daniel was powerful, well-connected, and protected by his charm and his money. If she made one wrong move, he would turn the story around, paint her as bitter, jealous, unstable. She couldn't let that happen, so she became what he least expected, invisible. She blended into the background of his life, letting him believe she was still fooled, still devoted. She kissed him goodnight, asked about his day, and nodded at his excuses, all while digging deeper into his world. The betrayal grew heavier every day. Every time he lied, every time he smiled at her with false sincerity, every time he left her for another woman, Emily's resolve hardened. She no longer saw Daniel as the man she had loved. She saw him as a lesson, a dangerous, cruel reminder of how easily trust can be shattered. And while he thought he was winning, while he thought she was still under his spell, Emily was already writing the ending of his story. The conflict between them was no longer hidden. It lived in every silence at the dinner table, in every glance she stole when he wasn't looking. He lived in arrogance, believing his lies would never catch up to him. She lived in patience, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Love had turned into betrayal. Betrayal had turned into conflict. And conflict was turning into something far more dangerous: revenge. The stage was being set. The empire was cracking, and Emily was holding the pieces that would bring it all down. She learned to move like a shadow, quiet and unnoticed, the way someone who has been betrayed learns to survive in the margins. Emily traded sleepless nights for careful plans, anger for a methodical calm that surprised even her. Where once her days had been filled with shared breakfasts and idle chatter, they were now filled with spreadsheets, late-night research, and small, meticulous steps toward a goal that burned brighter with every discovery. At first, her work was simple: collect what he left behind. A misplaced folder on his kitchen table, a half-opened laptop bag abandoned in a rush, a printed contract shoved under a stack of magazines. Each item was a small prize, a thread she could pull to unravel the bigger weave. She copied files, took photos, and made hidden backups. She learned to read legal terms and financial reports, terms that had once felt like a foreign language, but now became tools in her hands. The jargon that had masked his lies turned into the language of her power. She also learned how to be patient. Revenge isn't a blaze. It's a slow-burning fire. It needs fuel, but it also needs time. If she moved too fast, Daniel could turn the tide. He could use his charisma to make accusations sound like delusions. He could hire lawyers, smear her name, call her reckless. She couldn't let him. So she played the part he expected: patient, loving, somewhat naive, while underneath, she stitched together a case that would be impossible to deny. She reached out quietly to people who had been hurt by him, but she didn't announce herself. She created gentle, anonymous nudges that made them remember, made them doubt, made them look closer at the cracks they had ignored. One former employee, who once trusted Daniel with his future, responded to a carefully crafted email and met Emily for coffee. He didn't know who she was at first. He only knew his voice was shaking as he spoke about missing payments and promises unfulfilled. Emily listened. She collected names, dates, and small confirmations that, when combined, painted a picture worse than any single document could. She found an ally in a man named Martin, a lawyer who handled some of Daniel's legal affairs. She didn't tell him who she was. Instead, she posed as a concerned associate, a woman trying to understand the mess she suspected her partner was in. Martin, tired of cleaning up Daniel's improvisations, let slip truths he had grown weary of hiding. Inconsistencies in paperwork, offshore accounts that smelled of impropriety, signatures that looked suspiciously familiar when compared side by side. He didn't know Emily was the one who had his name pressed into her palm that night. If he had known, he might have been more careful. Instead, he became an unwitting source of confirmation. Another small stone in the foundation Emily was building. Every piece of information was checked twice, organized into folders, labeled, and dated. She created a timeline of Daniel's lies. When accounts shifted, when funds were directed through shell companies, when promises were made to certain investors and then broken without explanation. She learned to anticipate his moves. When he announced a new partnership with a flashy name and glossy press releases, She found the paperwork behind the curtain and read it like a map to his next misstep. When he lied about an acquisition, she dug until she found the transfer routes, the intermediary companies, the signatures that didn't belong. It would have been easy to let rage guide her, to confront him in a moment of fury and let the world see his true face. But Emily knew how those scenes played. Men like Daniel had a way of turning the narrative, of making themselves victims, and their victims look unstable. She wanted a verdict that no charm could overturn. She wanted evidence so cold and clear that even his smoothest lies would shatter against it. So she methodically cut the threads that tied her name to him. She found the forged documents that listed her as a silent partner in deals she had never heard of, and she began the slow, legal unspooling of each forged signature. She consulted Martin indirectly, learned about how such forgeries could be proven, and quietly began steps to protect herself financially. She opened separate accounts under her own name, moved funds she had saved into safer places, and made sure her personal records no longer fed into the web Daniel had spun. If he tried to drag her down with him, she would be ready to show the court and the world that she had been a victim, not an accomplice. Part of her plan required planting seeds of doubt. She whispered, not loudly but in soft, precise ways, into conversations where it would matter. She casually mentioned inconsistencies to former investors, left a curious file where a partner might find it, smiled, and acted surprised when someone else voiced a suspicion she had already expected them to voice. People who had once admired Daniel began to ask questions. They didn't accuse, they simply asked, and questions are dangerous in a house built on lies. She also kept a careful record of his infidelities. That betrayal had cut her deepest, not just because of the act, but because it revealed a truth about him she could not unknow. She knew the image of him stepping into another woman's arms would sting, and she kept the knowledge as a private proof of the man he was. It wasn't leverage she wanted to use for humiliation. It was evidence of character. A man who betrayed love without shame was unlikely to stop betraying others. She stored that image with the spreadsheets and contracts, a human detail to show the whole person for what he had become. As weeks turned into months, Emily felt the careful changes take effect. People she contacted began to doubt. Small investors pulled back, not yet publicly, but in private conversations that made Daniel's phone calls longer and excuses thinner. An assistant who had been paid late finally quit and spoke in hushed tones about missing payrolls. A supplier who had once been paid promptly stopped returning calls. The cracks she had been chipping away at widened into fissures. Emily was careful to shield herself from the temptation to savor small victories. Each one was a sign that she was closer, not done. If she allowed herself to rest on them, Daniel might spot a pattern and tighten his defenses. He had begun to notice something. She could see it in his distracted calls, in the way he paced at night, in the way his laughter no longer reached his eyes. But he didn't know who was watching. He had no idea that the woman he had kept by his side, the one he had thought naive and in love, had become the architect of his undoing. Her strategy grew bolder as opportunity presented itself. Daniel loved to create spectacles, charity galas, investor nights, glossy presentations where he shone under spotlights, and the audience clapped without knowing the truth. Those events were his stage, but they could also be his undoing. Emily decided that when the time came, she would use his own stage to present the truth in a way he could not script away. Before that, though, she had to secure her own position. She made sure the legal evidence she had collected was authenticated. She paid a private forensic accountant, discreetly and in cash, to examine the records and verify transfers, to create a report that translated her discoveries into incontrovertible facts. The accountant, a stoic woman named Rosa with a sharp eye and an even sharper tongue, confirmed what Emily already suspected. The numbers didn't add up, and the paper trail led to companies that existed only on paper. When Rosa handed her the printed report, Emily felt a surge of both relief and cold determination. This was the proof that could not be twisted into armor. Emily also knew she needed witnesses. Documents could be disputed, but the testimony of those who had been wronged would carry weight. She spoke to former employees, to suppliers, to small-time investors who had been charmed into giving money on Daniel's promises. She recorded their statements, sometimes in person, sometimes over carefully arranged meetings where she let them speak freely. Their words, their anger, and their disappointment became a choir of truth that, when combined with the dry facts of the accountant's report, would form a symphony no lie could drown out. There were nights when the enormity of it all threatened to crush her. She would lie awake and imagine the moment of exposure, and then see herself walking away into the light. But sometimes that imagined victory felt hollow. Would the world understand? Would the media turn her into a villain for daring to expose a man everyone else loved? She had to steel herself against the fear of being judged. That fear, she understood, was another tool in Daniel's arsenal. The power to make people doubt the accuser rather than the accused. Emily refused to let him weaponize shame against her. Every night she rehearsed the facts like a script, not to perform in front of people, but to make sure that when the moment came, she would speak with clarity, not anger. She wanted to be calm, articulate, and unassailable. She wanted the truth to sit like a stone in the center of the room, undeniable and heavy. The plan coalesced into a final sequence. Present the evidence to key partners quietly before a big public event. Let their questions seed doubt in the room during his presentation, and then release the full report to the press and legal authorities in a way that left no room for spin. It was bold, but she had learned that Daniel thrived on the grand gesture. It was also where he was weakest because spectacle requires an audience that believes. Once the audience turned skeptical, his performance would crumble. On the night before the event, Emily felt a peculiar calm. She had arranged meetings with two of Daniel's most influential partners, men who had the power to pull support at the first sign of trouble. She handed them the forensic report and the recorded testimonies, watched as their faces went from curiosity to shock to grim resolve. One of them looked at her and said quietly, "If this is true, you've done what we should have done months ago." She didn't let herself feel triumphant. Instead, she felt the weight of responsibility settle over her. This was no longer about hurting him for the sake of revenge. It was about stopping a man who had been allowed to harm others without consequence. It was about reclaiming the reality that had been stolen from her, and from everyone else he had lied to. She walked out of that meeting with a file under her arm and a quiet certainty in her heart. The next day, under the chandelier light and the applause he so loved, Daniel would be asked questions he could no longer charm away. And when that moment came, she would not be the woman who wept privately in the dark. She would be the one who stepped into the light and lifted the veil. There was fear, of course, but it was a readable thing now, a necessary companion to courage. She had done the work. She had collected the facts, the witnesses, the financial proof. She had tightened her own safety net. All that remained was to act. The shadow she had become now moved toward the brightest room in the building, ready to show everyone what had been hidden behind his smile. Under the golden chandeliers of the city's grandest ballroom, Daniel thrived like a king in his palace. The night was his stage, every detail carefully orchestrated to reinforce his illusion of power. Waiters glided between tables with silver trays. Glasses clinked. Laughter bubbled over the live band's music. And Daniel stood at the center of it all, basking in the glow. He was dressed in a tailored suit so sharp it could have cut glass, his smile as polished as the marble floors beneath him. He shook hands, told jokes, and promised futures he had no intention of delivering. To the casual observer, he looked unstoppable. But Emily knew that behind the fabric of his charm, loose threads were waiting to be pulled. She slipped into the event with quiet grace, unnoticed among the swirl of gowns and tuxedos. To everyone else, she was just another guest. But inside, her heart drummed with a rhythm that matched the suspense of her plan. She carried no visible weapon, no grand declaration, only the invisible arsenal she had built over months of sleepless nights. Documents, testimonies, facts too sharp to ignore. Tonight her silence was her power. Daniel would not see her as a threat until the walls began to close around him. And by then, it would be far too late. As he moved through the crowd, Emily caught the subtle flicker of unease in his eyes. It was there in the way he checked his phone more often than usual, in the hesitation before his laughter, in the quick glances toward the exits as though some hidden fear had followed him here. He knew something was shifting beneath him, even if he couldn't yet name it. Emily had planted the seeds with his partners, and now those seeds were beginning to sprout. She could see it in the wary way they watched him, their smiles thinner, their handshakes shorter. Daniel's speech was the night's centerpiece. The stage had been set with a velvet curtain, a sleek podium, and a screen projecting his company's logo in bold letters. Guests gathered with expectant applause, eager to hear his vision for the future. He loved these moments, when all eyes were on him, when every word he spoke seemed to shape reality itself. But tonight the spotlight was a trap. Tonight, the very stage he adored would become his undoing. As he began his speech, his voice carried its usual rhythm of confidence. He spoke of expansion, of partnerships, of a future so dazzling it left his audience wide-eyed. He wove his promises like silk, each phrase designed to hypnotize. But Emily watched the faces in the crowd, and this time, not all of them were entranced. A murmur stirred when one of the partners she had warned exchanged a glance with another. A few people whispered, their brows furrowing as Daniel boasted figures that no longer aligned with the documents in Emily's possession. Then came the first interruption. A voice from the crowd, sharp but controlled, called out, "Daniel, can you explain the discrepancies in last quarter's reports?" The room fell silent, the kind of silence that claws at the air. Daniel's practiced smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before he smoothed it over with a chuckle. "Every growing business has a few wrinkles in the numbers," he said lightly, waving it off. But the question had broken the spell. More murmurs followed. Emily's breath caught in her chest. The unraveling had begun. Another voice rose, this time with more weight. "And what about the offshore accounts? Are you planning to address those tonight?" This time Daniel's mask cracked. He hesitated, the spotlight catching the sudden sheen of sweat on his forehead. He reached for a glass of water, his hand trembling just enough for Emily to notice. The audience shifted in their seats, leaning forward not with admiration, but suspicion. Emily remained in the shadows of the crowd, her eyes locked on him. She didn't need to speak. She had already done her work. The partners, armed with her evidence, were steering the questions now. Each one chipped away at the facade he had built, and Daniel, for all his smooth words, struggled to patch the widening holes. A ripple of tension spread through the room. Phones buzzed quietly under the tables as people began searching for answers, cross-checking his claims against what Emily had already set loose. Whispers became sharper, and admiration shifted to doubt. For a man who thrived on adoration, the sudden shift was like watching oxygen drain from his lungs. Daniel tried to push through, raising his voice, spinning new promises, but his rhythm was broken. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for loyalty, finding none. The applause he had expected at each beat of his speech never came. Instead, there was silence. Heavy, questioning, damning. Emily could feel the climax approaching. Soon, the press would receive the full report she had prepared. Soon Daniel's empire would collapse under the weight of truth. But tonight, in this glittering ballroom, she let him feel the first tremors of downfall. The irony was sharp. The man who had thrived under the light was now being undone by it, stripped bare in front of the very people who once believed in him. As Daniel stumbled through his closing words, his voice strained and his smile fractured, Emily felt a surge of both triumph and sorrow. This was not just the destruction of his empire. This was the moment when the world would finally see the man she had known all along. Not a visionary, not a hero, but a liar built on borrowed time. And as the applause came, not warm, but scattered and uncertain, Daniel stood alone at the podium, his kingdom already slipping through his fingers. Emily turned away, unseen in the crowd, her work unfinished but her victory inevitable. The night was far from over. The real storm was still to come. The night had left Daniel shaken, though he did everything in his power to pretend otherwise. After the scattered applause faded and the ballroom lights dimmed, he retreated backstage with the sharp stiffness of a man who suddenly realized the ground beneath him was cracking. His assistants hovered nervously, offering reassurances he didn't believe. He snapped at them, demanded explanations for questions he hadn't anticipated, and insisted it was nothing more than jealous rivals trying to smear his name. But deep inside, the confidence that had always fueled his performances was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread he couldn't shake. Emily lingered in the periphery of the crowd, slipping away quietly before Daniel could spot her. She didn't need to confront him, not yet. Her work that night had been subtle, the first gust of wind before a storm. The true reckoning was already in motion, invisible to most but undeniable once it hit, because even as Daniel tried to regain his composure, a different kind of audience was receiving the truth. The files she had prepared, the testimonies, the forensic accountant's report, all of it had been released to the press and key legal authorities at the exact moment his speech began. In newsrooms across the city, journalists were scanning through the documents with wide eyes. Some had long suspected something shady behind Daniel's empire, but they had lacked the proof. Now the proof sat in their inboxes, organized, dated, impossible to ignore. Editors made quick calls, reporters drafted breaking stories. Headlines were prepared that would dominate the next morning's front pages. Visionary CEO exposed in shocking financial web. Allegations of fraud rock high-profile entrepreneur E. Investors question Daniel Hale as evidence emerges. At the same time, an envelope was delivered to the district attorney's office. Inside were the same files, authenticated and backed by Rosa's meticulous analysis. It was enough to open an investigation, enough to freeze accounts, enough to make powerful people pause before defending Daniel. And Daniel, unaware of just how fast the walls were closing in, still clung to the illusion that he could spin his way out. By the next morning, his phone was ringing nonstop. Some calls were from partners demanding answers, others from journalists looking for statements, and others still from investors whose money now seemed less like an investment and more like a trap. He barked at his assistant to issue press releases, to arrange interviews where he could charm the narrative back into his hands. But each attempt fell flat. For every excuse he crafted, a document existed that contradicted it. For every denial, a witness stepped forward with testimony. The empire that once seemed untouchable was now fragile, exposed. Emily watched from a distance as the unraveling gained speed. She sat in a small cafe sipping coffee, her laptop open to the news sites streaming headlines one after another. It wasn't gloating she felt. It was a grim satisfaction, the sense of justice finally breaking through the silence that had suffocated her. She thought of the nights she had doubted herself, the times she had nearly believed Daniel's lies that she was overreacting, imagining, unstable. Those lies were ashes now, scattered by the wind of undeniable truth. But the real twist hadn't arrived yet. Emily had saved the most devastating piece for last. Not for the press, not for the public, but for Daniel himself. She knew the one thing he valued more than money, more than reputation, more even than power: control. He lived for the ability to script the story, to make others dance to his rhythm. And Emily had designed her final move to shatter that illusion completely. She arranged to meet him in a place that carried history for them both, a rooftop bar overlooking the city. It was where he had once toasted her, promising a future of endless possibilities, where he had painted dreams in the night sky with his words. Back then she had believed him. Now she returned not as the naive woman who had clung to those promises, but as the orchestrator of his undoing. When Daniel arrived, he was visibly frayed. His perfect grooming was still intact, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted restlessly, his smile too sharp, his movements edged with desperation. He tried to play his old role, leaning in with practiced charm, but Emily's calm silence cut through it. She didn't flinch. She didn't let him lead the dance. "You've been busy," he said finally, his voice low, carrying a hint of accusation. "I know it's you. I know you've been feeding lies to the press." "They're not lies," Emily replied softly, her voice steady, almost gentle. "They're the truth you've been hiding. And now the world knows." Daniel's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, dropping the charm for cold menace. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You think you've won, but you've destroyed everything. My company, my reputation, you'll go down with me." Emily's eyes didn't waver. "No, Daniel. That's the difference between us. You dragged me into your world without asking. You forged my name, used my trust, and made me complicit in things I never agreed to. But I've pulled myself out. I've cleared my name. What falls now is yours alone." For the first time, Daniel looked uncertain. His bluster faltered, replaced by something raw: fear. He had spent his life weaving lies that made him invincible, But here, facing the woman he had underestimated, he realized his web was gone. Emily leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through him. The empire you built was never real. It was smoke and mirrors, and now the mirrors are broken. Daniel opened his mouth, perhaps to threaten, perhaps to plead, but Emily stood before he could speak. She placed a small envelope on the table, sliding it toward him. "This is for you. It's not for the press, not for the courts, just for you." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone under the city lights. When he opened the envelope, his hands shook. Inside were photographs, emails, recordings, all the personal betrayals he thought she never knew about. The affairs, the secret messages, the moments he had thought invisible. It wasn't meant for public humiliation. It was meant for him alone, a mirror to force him to see the man he truly was. The empire crumbling outside was one thing, but this was the private, undeniable truth. Daniel sat there in silence, the noise of the city fading around him, the weight of his empire's collapse, now matched by the intimate weight of his own reflection. For once he had no words, no charm, no story to spin. Only the truth, staring back at him from the pages Emily had left behind. And somewhere in the night, Emily walked away, free at last from the shadow of his lies. She hadn't just broken his empire, she had broken the illusion he lived in. And that, more than anything, was the final twist. The news spread like wildfire. Within days, Daniel's name, once synonymous with success and visionary leadership, was plastered across every headline, but never in the way he wanted. Words like fraud, betrayal, exposed, and collapse clung to him like shadows he couldn't shake. Investors withdrew en masse. Accounts were frozen, and lawsuits piled up faster than he could read them. The empire he had built on sand was washing away under a tide of truth, and the more he scrambled to explain, the more the world saw the desperation behind his smile. Television panels dissected his downfall with relish. Analysts who had once praised his brilliance now dissected the flaws they had ignored, speaking with the smug certainty of hindsight. Business magazines pulled old interviews and highlighted the inconsistencies they had brushed past. The very people who had applauded him at his galas now distanced themselves, their statements carefully worded to show they had been deceived as much as anyone else. Daniel was no longer the golden boy of ambition. He was a cautionary tale of arrogance. Behind the scenes, legal gears began to turn. The district attorney's office opened a full-scale investigation. Former employees testified that their voice had finally been given weight by the evidence Emily had gathered. Rosa's forensic reports became the backbone of the case, a map of deceit that prosecutors followed with grim precision. One by one, Daniel's shell companies were dismantled, his accounts scrutinized, his forged signatures laid bare in court filings. Lawyers who once fought to protect him now jumped ship, unwilling to sink with a client who had become toxic. For Daniel, life became a shrinking circle. Friends stopped returning calls, partners cut ties. Even his most loyal assistants slipped away quietly, looking for safer ground. He went from commanding rooms filled with hundreds to sitting alone in his penthouse, curtains drawn, the sound of his phone buzzing with demands he could no longer meet. The empire that had once made him untouchable was now a cage closing in around him. Emily, on the other hand, felt the weight lift from her shoulders with every headline, every new revelation. She didn't celebrate publicly. That wasn't her style. But in private, she allowed herself moments of quiet victory. She would wake in the morning, open her laptop, and read about the empire crumbling brick by brick, and she would smile. Not because she enjoyed his suffering, but because justice was finally visible, not hidden behind charm and lies. But Emily's journey wasn't just about his downfall. It was also about rebuilding the pieces of her own life that he had tried to claim. She returned to her work with a new sense of purpose, stronger and sharper than before. She reached out to people she had lost touch with during the years of being overshadowed by Daniel's world, and one by one, those connections blossomed again. Friends who had doubted her now saw the truth, and though the scars of betrayal couldn't vanish overnight, she no longer carried the shame of being disbelieved. She also found herself helping others who had been burned by him. Former employees, small investors, even acquaintances who had been manipulated. They came to her, some with gratitude, some with their own stories. She listened. She offered guidance. She became, without intending it, a quiet anchor for those who had been left adrift in his wake. It was ironic, she thought sometimes, that the man who had tried to silence her had inadvertently made her voice stronger, more trusted, more respected than ever. Meanwhile, Daniel faced the slow grind of consequences. Court hearings became routine. His name, once gilded, was now spoken in the same breath as fraudsters and schemers. Photographs of him entering court in wrinkled suits replaced the glossy magazine covers of his glory days. The confident sparkle in his eyes was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man who knew every door was closing. Even when he tried to launch desperate counterattacks, blaming former partners, accusing rivals, hinting at conspiracies, the public no longer believed him. His credibility was gone, and without it, he was nothing. Emily didn't attend the hearings. She didn't need to. She had already done her part. Instead, she focused on her own healing. There were nights when memories still came back. The warmth of his lies, the sting of betrayal. But they no longer broke her. They reminded her of the journey she had survived, of the strength she had discovered in herself. She journaled, she traveled, she laughed again in ways she hadn't thought possible. Life after betrayal was not easy, but it was real. And that authenticity mattered more than any illusion he had offered. Months passed. Daniel's world shrank further. Properties were seized, luxury cars repossessed, and his penthouse emptied out by court orders. The man who once commanded armies of employees now shuffled through hallways with only lawyers and guards for company. He was a king with no throne, a storyteller with no audience. And though Emily never wished him physical harm, she knew this. The loss of control, the silence of power, was the punishment that cut him deepest. One evening, Emily stood on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. She thought about the long road that had led her here, the nights of doubt, the hours of planning, the courage it had taken to expose him. And she thought about what came next. Life was hers again, unbound, unclaimed. She could shape it however she wished. That was the true revenge, she realized. Not just breaking his empire, but reclaiming her own. And so, as Daniel's name became a footnote in cautionary tales, Emily's life blossomed into something he could never touch. She had turned pain into strength, betrayal into clarity, and revenge into renewal. And though she carried the scars, she also carried the wisdom that came with them. Because in the end, It wasn't just his empire that broke. It was the illusion that she was powerless. And once that illusion was shattered, Emily knew she would never be the same again. She would never bow to someone else's lies. She would never doubt her own strength. And in that quiet, in that hard-earned freedom, she found peace. Betrayal is a wound that never announces itself. It creeps in silently, disguised as love, loyalty, friendship, or trust. And when it strikes, it doesn't just cut you off from another person. It cuts into the core of who you are. Emily understood this more than most. For a long time, she believed the betrayal she suffered from Daniel had destroyed her. But in the quiet that followed his downfall, she realized something extraordinary. Betrayal had revealed her. It had forced her to see truths she might have otherwise ignored, and it had shown her the strength she never knew she possessed. In the beginning, the pain was raw, almost unbearable. Nights stretched endlessly, filled with questions that had no answers. Why did he do it? Why me? Was everything a lie? These were the thoughts that haunted her, echoing in every corner of her mind. She remembered lying awake in the darkness, the city outside alive with lights and noise, while she felt like her world had ended. That's what betrayal does. It isolates you, convinces you that you're alone in a world that once felt safe. But as she moved forward, step by trembling step, Emily began to see that she wasn't alone. Every person at some point faces betrayal. From a lover, a friend, a family member, even from themselves. Betrayal is universal, but what defines us is not the betrayal itself. It's what we do after. Do we remain shattered, letting the pieces of ourselves lie scattered on the floor? Or do we gather them, slowly, painfully, and rebuild them into something stronger? That was the choice Emily faced. And it's the choice every listener, every viewer of her story, faces in their own lives. Revenge had been her first answer. The thought of seeing Daniel fall gave her purpose. When the pain was too much, she imagined the day when his lies would be dragged into the light, when his empire would crumble as easily as he had crumbled her trust. And though revenge alone cannot heal a heart, it can ignite a spark. It gave her something to fight for when she had nothing else. And in fighting for justice, she discovered the one thing Daniel had always underestimated about her: her resilience. But revenge was never the destination. It was the bridge. The real destination was freedom. Freedom from his shadow. Freedom from his lies. Freedom from the weight of carrying his betrayal on her shoulders. And that freedom came not from watching him fall, but from rising herself. She noticed the shift the first time she laughed again. Really laughed. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep, unforced and genuine. It startled her. She hadn't realized how long she had been holding her breath, living cautiously, waiting for the other shoe to drop. That laugh was a reminder. Life was not over. Life was still waiting for her, ready to be lived fully and without fear. She thought often about the lessons betrayal teaches. The first is that people are not always who they seem. That truth is painful, but it is also freeing, because once you accept it, you stop expecting others to complete you, to define you, to validate you. You realize that trust begins with yourself. Emily had given Daniel her trust blindly, believing his charm, his promises, his carefully crafted image. But in the end, she learned that her greatest mistake was not trusting him. It was doubting herself when the warning signs appeared. That became her second lesson. Always listen to your intuition. Those small alarms in the back of your mind, the uneasy feelings you dismiss as paranoia, They are there for a reason. Emily had silenced those alarms for too long, convincing herself that love meant ignoring the cracks. Never again, she promised herself. Love built on silencing your truth is not love at all. Her third lesson was perhaps the hardest. Forgiveness. Not of him. No, she knew some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness in the way people often imagine it. But forgiveness of herself. Forgiving herself for believing him, for staying too long, for doubting her own worth. That self-forgiveness didn't come easily. It took months of reflection, tears, conversations with friends, and even moments of anger that she let herself finally feel instead of bottling up. But when she reached it, she felt lighter, freer. She realized she had punished herself far longer than Daniel ever could. Daniel's empire became a ghost story in the city, something people whispered about in boardrooms and coffee shops, a tale of arrogance and downfall. But for Emily, it was never just about him. It was about reclaiming her life. And that reclamation didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. A journal entry where she poured out her truth. A walk in the park where she felt the sun warm her face. A night out with old friends where she remembered what laughter among people who truly cared felt like. Each small step was a thread, weaving a new fabric of her life. She often reflected on how easily people mistake strength. To outsiders, Daniel had once seemed strong, confident, bold, unstoppable. But real strength, Emily learned, isn't about power over others. It's about power over yourself. It's about choosing truth over lies, integrity over shortcuts, resilience over despair. Daniel had none of that strength. His empire was built on deception, and deception always collapses under its own weight. Emily's strength, though quieter, was unshakable. It was the strength to face pain, to carry scars, to rise anyway. And as her story spread, it became something more than personal. It became a mirror for others. People reached out to her with their own tales of betrayal. Some had been betrayed in love, others in business, others by friends or family. And though the details differed, the ache was the same. Emily listened. She offered what she had learned, that betrayal may change you, but it doesn't have to destroy you. That revenge may give you fire, but healing gives you life. That the end of one story is always the beginning of another. In the quiet of her new life, Emily found herself standing often on her balcony at night, looking out over the same city that had once felt like a battlefield. The lights glittered, the hum of life continued, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the fragile peace of denial, but the grounded peace of truth. She had faced betrayal, endured revenge, and emerged with clarity. She was no longer the woman defined by his shadow. She was her own, and for those who listened to her story, she left behind a final message. Never let betrayal convince you that you are powerless. Never let someone else's lies make you doubt your own truth. You may feel broken now. You may feel lost. You may even feel like your story has ended, but it hasn't. Like Emily, you can rise. You can rebuild, and in that rebuilding, you will discover strength you never imagined. Because betrayal is not the end. Betrayal is the turning point, the moment when illusions shatter, when lies crumble, when the truth finally demands to be seen. And though it hurts, though it may feel unbearable, it is also the moment when you are given a choice to stay broken or to rise stronger. Emily chose to rise, and so can you. And perhaps that is the true twist, the final revelation of her story. Daniel believed he had broken her. He believed betrayal had given him the last word. But in the end, it wasn't his empire that defined the ending. It was her resilience, her courage, her refusal to remain silent. He lost everything, but she gained something he could never touch: freedom, self-respect, and peace. So, when you walk away from this story, carry this lesson with you. Revenge may shake the world, but healing is what rebuilds it. Justice may end the chapter, but resilience begins the next one. And no matter how deep the betrayal, no matter how heavy the scars, you are more powerful than the lies told against you. Emily's empire was not built of buildings or bank accounts. Her empire was built in truth, and truth endures, always.